It's great to be joined today by Michael Lynch, who's the director of the Humanities Institute, a professor of philosophy at the University of Connecticut, also author of the new book, Know-It-All Society, Truth and Arrogance in Political Culture. Michael, so great to talk to you.
Thanks so much for having me.
This is such an interesting topic to me, the idea of the sort of combination of a much longer period of pseudo and anti-intellectualism, which has sort of combined with or crashed with this intellectual arrogance trend that we're seeing partially because of the internet and social media. Can you first just talk a little bit about what are some of the ways that internet and social media have made people intellectually arrogant?
Well, when we talk about, first of all, when we talk about intellectual arrogance, what I mean is the idea of being resistant to improving your worldview by appeal to evidence or to the experience of other people. It's the idea that you know it all, and that your worldview is, at least with some respects, unimprovable. And I think there are pretty obvious ways that all of us are really intimately familiar with, in which the internet and the ways in which we use the internet can reinforce and encourage this attitude. I mean, for one thing, no matter what your opinion you may have on any topic, you can Google and get some confirmation for that opinion from some corner of the internet, dark or not. And in a way, right now, it used to be that seeing was believing, we'd say, but now Googling is believing. And therefore, getting information in that way, the sort of weird paradoxical fact is that our ability to get information in that way so easily, right at our fingertips, is also not just making us, in a sense, feel more knowledgeable, but feel that we are always right, because of the ability to confirm our biases. I mean, add one other element to that, which is that the internet is a personalized information-seeking device, as it were, a set of devices and platforms. Everything that we encounter on the internet, from the news that comes down our Facebook feed to the ads that we see on the pages we visit, are all personalized. And of course, that's great when we're shopping for books or shoes or what have you. It's not so great when we're shopping for facts, because if you're just getting the facts that confirm your pre-existing prejudices, that's a short road to a type of epistemic disaster.
Yeah, there are some elements to the social media platforms, the way you're talking about algorithmically and otherwise, which sort of encourage or perpetuate a sort of reasoning from emotion and style rather than facts. But beyond that, is there something about social media and the internet that just beyond the algorithms does encourage people to be arguing more from emotion rather than from fact?
Yeah, I think there is. I think that one of the things that besides the sort of algorithms and the personalization, one of the things that I think is really motivating this rise that we see in a type of arrogance, and including what I would call a type of tribal arrogance, is that we're often unaware of how we're communicating on social media. We're sort of, in a sense, blind to the real nature of our communicative acts. Here's an example. When we all share something online that's a news story, whether it's fake or otherwise, when we share some piece of news content, from The Guardian or from this show or what have you, you think of yourself as, at least I do, as like sharing some piece of, factual information, or at least saying, here's some interesting opinion that you should probably pay attention to. And I'm saying that to my friends or followers.
Yeah.
So it looks like I'm engaging in sort of the game of, giving reasons and so forth. But really, it seems like we might be doing something else. So one reason to think that is because a lot of data is coming out right now that show that something that we probably all intuitively know, which is that almost no one that shares things online reads what they share. And what that suggests something. It suggests that we're doing something else we're communicating in some other way. And what I think we're often doing is what we're doing is signaling that, well, we're a member of a particular tribe or group. We're saying we're on this team. And we're communicating, in other words, a sort of emotional feeling. Or perhaps we're communicating a sense of outrage. And of course, the platforms are hardwired to encourage this sort of thing. The sorts of the treats, again, things that most of people listening here are going to know, is that the more sort of emotional language you include in your tweet or your post, the more sort of language of outrage you include, the higher the likelihood that that will be reposted, reshared, or retweeted. And that fact alone suggests that the whole economy of social media is encouraging us to engage in this sort of expression of sentiment, as David Hume, the philosopher, would have called it, or emotion. And the fact that we're not aware that we're actually doing that makes us really easy marks.
Yeah, well, this starts to dovetail with findings from such varied academic disciplines as what Jonathan Haidt has written about in moral psychology,
exactly.
what Daniel Kahneman has written about in behavioral economics, that in many times we believe that we have come to our conclusions based on the evidence, when in reality we've often come to our conclusions for other reasons. Haidt would say it relates to our moral values that resonate more with us. Daniel Kahneman would have more of a logistical, practical behavioral economics approach, but that we are first coming to our conclusions, then finding information to justify them. And that's where I think social media has really scaled up this mechanism.
Yeah, it's definitely a device, a mechanism, as you just said, to fuel confirmation bias. I mean, there's been a lot of research, as most of the listeners will probably know, about the sort of bubbles, the information and epistemic bubbles that we live in. That is fueled by the personalization we talked about, and also encouraged by the hard wiring of the platforms, as I was talking about them, to encourage the emotional exchange over informational exchange. I mean, I think what we're finding is that both the economy of social media and our psychology, our human psychology, are just working together and forming a sort of toxic mix that's increasing this type of arrogance that we're talking about. Of course, you have to add to that politics, ideology. Right now in our country, there are ideologies that are starting to celebrate the idea that facts and reason and the experts and science celebrate that those things should not be listened to, and that you should trust your gut, and that you should trust your tribe, and that it's the tribe that gives power, and it's not and we're not answerable to the facts. That ideology, together with the psychology that we were just talking about, and the technology, that's a real toxic mix, and it's really leading to what I'm calling the know-it-all society.
So that's what I wanted to talk about next, which is what do we know empirically or quantitatively about the partisan divide on some of these phenomena? Because, for example, there are many reports which say, if you look back at the 2016 election, the amount of actual fake news, not using the definition of the current president, but actual just straight fake news that was shared, was significantly higher by conservatives than by liberals, as one example of showing that this phenomena is not sort of taking root equally across partisanship. What can you add to our understanding of the partisan element to this sort of cultural element that you've identified, the know-it-all society?
Okay, well, when we think about polarization, so let's step back a little bit and think about what, common topic of conversation in conversations like this, which is that, we're polarized. Recent data, for example, from Pew suggests that on a range of issues, on actual issues, if you poll people who are both conservative-leaning, conservative, liberal-leaning, liberal, you find, surprisingly, while of course Americans are strongly divided on a whole number of issues, there's actually much more agreement than you might antecedently think.
Yes.
At the same time, at the same time, there is increasingly a dramatic increase in polarization of what we might call affective polarization or group polarization. That is, we are more and more prone to describe the people on the other side of the aisle as distrustful, as untrustworthy, as immoral, as ignorant. And we increasingly know that the other side describes us, whoever the us is, in the same way. And we resent them for it. So the first thing I think to keep in mind is that there's a growing awareness that we are sort of polarized in this way, and there's a strong resentment and antagonism that's being fueled precisely from that awareness. Now, to get back to your question about how these different ideologies, both on the left and the right, respond or react to that, I think in very different ways. There's no doubt right now, at least in my mind, that many of the ideologies on the right, particularly ideologies that are driven by nationalism and white nationalism in particular, are ideologies that are self-consciously celebrating a rejection of what we might have called rational authority. That's part of what's fueling some of the enthusiasm, I think, that we see from particular advocates of that ideology online. The thought is, and we see it, I think, and indeed by the inhabitant of the White House. I mean, if you want to talk about arrogance, it seems like exhibit number one, of course, is Donald Trump, a man who, after all, has been known to say that he's the humblest person that he knows. Look, I think it's not. I think it is a surprise to most of your listeners that white nationalism is a view according to which whites are superior. Whites intrinsically know more, are better people. That sort of nonsense. That's clearly an attitude that is symbolized by or embodies this type of arrogance that I've been discussing. And I think that the degree to which that continues to be propagated is the degree to which we're going to see an increasing sort of affective polarization that we were talking about before. On the other hand, I also want to point out that, look, it's if you want to look up intellectually arrogant in the dictionary, you're probably going to find a picture of a face very much like mine. I mean, I'm a white male liberal progressive college professor. To a lot of people in the country, I embody intellectual arrogance, and I imagine some of the people listening have probably been thinking that. Fair enough. I think it's important that progressives realize that we are not immune to implicit bias. We are not immune to the sort of problems that are inherent in human psychology that afflict the rest of mankind, so to speak. Progressives, I think I have been guilty of this, and some of your listeners might think I've been guilty of this already, is that you can fall into thinking that, conservatives, they're all like, they all fall into the same buckets. They all are the ones that have prejudice and bias, and we are the tribe of reason and rationality, and we are free of those things. That's a mistake. It is falling into the same type of tribal arrogance that I, for one, am trying to combat.
So I will somewhat frequently get phone calls from viewers who will say, hey, David, a couple years ago, I fell into an alt-right sort of echo chamber. I was watching some gaming thing on YouTube, which led me to Stefan Molyneux and then Ben Shapiro. And they describe the path in, and they say I bought into it completely. And then the algorithm showed me a left-wing gamer, which brought me to you and to, they'll name other people that do what I do. And now I'm out. I've sort of been deprogrammed from that. And of course, my initial reaction is, okay, the outcome is a good one as far as I see it. But is there not a bigger problem here that merely by clicking around on YouTube, you were first pulled to the extreme right, and then merely by chance you became pushed to the extreme left? I hear the way too malleable nature of so many people's thinking. And I'm curious what your reaction is to those stories of radicalization and de-radicalization, which, even if we like the way that the outcome went, to me signal a sort of problematic, deeper problem.
That's a really interesting point. Like you, of course, I celebrate people becoming de-radicalized,
Yes.
particularly from violent nationalist ideologies. But I also agree that what that sort of anecdote or story illustrates is the passiveness by which most of what the passive way in which most of us seem to know nowadays. Much of what we know, we Google now, as I was talking about earlier. That's how most people today receive most of their information. And while, again, that can be really super useful. I Google know all day, every day. It's also, I think, changing the way we interface with information and how we critically evaluate it. I think that one of the things that I talk about in the book is some lessons from some very ancient philosophical figures, including going back all the way to Socrates. Socrates, one of the things that's really interesting about the lessons you can glean from the end of his life is that he was somebody who was interested in questioning both authority and himself. He said, well, one of the things that the only thing I really can say I know is that I don't know very much. And he was keen, of course, to sort of bring down the people who claim that they know quite a bit about things. And he took some pleasure, clearly, in getting them to admit that they didn't know as much as they did. And that's great. But he also wanted us to focus on our own attitudes. And he thought that in order to do that, you needed to get outside on the street, literally, and start talking to people, to start having conversations. I think there's something to be said with that attitude, not so much as that you can't talk to people online like we're doing right now. That's perfectly, I think, Socratic. What Socrates, I think, was really pushing us there was to think of ourselves not as passive, just suckers of information, but as active inquirers, people who get out and try to, read, engage, talk to one another, and question assumptions. And as I said, continue to question yourself and your own biases and prejudices that you might not have been aware that you actually have.
Very, very good advice for sure. And if only it was taking place, if only it was easier to make that the reality based on how a lot of these online platforms are deliberately configured to really generate the opposite. We've been speaking with Michael Lynch, who's author of the new book, Know-It-All Society, Truth and Arrogance in Political Culture. Michael, really a pleasure having you on today.
Thanks so much. It was great.